Expanding Mind with Erik Davis, Thursdays at 2 p.m. on the Progressive Radio Network.
Welcome to another edition of Expanding Mind. I'm your host, Erik Davis. And today we're going to be taking a little journey around the world, particularly to Antarctica, hopefully. Our guest for the day, DJ Spooky, a.k.a. Paul Miller. I talked to him half an hour ago on the phone, and he seemed ready to roll. And we're trying to get him on the phone right now, so we're going to assume that that's going to come in. I've known Paul for a long time. When I was working at the Village Voice in the early 90s, I saw this sticker that was like stuck on the side of a wall, and it was like this really cool image of the Veve for the Vodun deity Legba, which I was a big fan of, and so I was actually able to recognize this rather arcane symbol, which impressed the fellow who had stuck the sticker on the wall, which is none other than Paul Miller. And so we struck up a friendship right in the day, and he was living in, I think he was living in the gas station at that point, and, being an underground electronic DJ, freakazoid, character, to beat all characters, in a very wonderful and weird time to be in New York City. And so I've had the great pleasure of sort of seeing him develop. It's a funny thing when somebody you're friends with becomes famous. Just in general, it's kind of interesting because you have this different kind of relationship to them. But Paul's career in particular has been fascinating because it's such an unusual career. He's like refused to stay put in any one genre. He comes out as a musician working in different genres, crossing high and low dance music and avant-garde, then drifting through art scenes, through philosophy, teaching in highbrow media institutions, giving lectures at Ivy League institutes, playing shows for fashion events, traveling around the world. He's been more places than anyone I know personally, so it's been totally fascinating to track him and his relationship to the globe is a particularly interesting one. It's very much about the way he's trying to cut up culture, cut up what it means to be a human being, an artist, a thinker at this point in history. And some of his latest work is also involved with that sense of the globe. His new book that hopefully we'll be talking about soon, I believe we're set, it's coming up, is called The Book of Ice, a manifesto for People's Republic of Antarctica. And it's a super cool, image-heavy journey to Antarctica where he spent a lot of time, and where he recorded music for Terra Nova, which is a piece he did based on the sounds of the ice. And he also has this project in Polynesia called Vanuatu. So we're going to keep on trying to get Paul here, but in the meantime, we're going to bring Maja on. Maja, how are you doing there?
Hi, Erik. I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good. Have you ever seen DJ Spooky play or perform?
I've never seen him play live, but I've listened to lots of his stuff and been really into a lot of the things he's done, like his science fiction stuff, because I'm a big sci-fi nerd. So he had, I think, known Jonathan Lethem, who I got into Jonathan Lethem when I was a librarian in the Seattle Public Library, and then actually came across him that way. Was my first introduction. It wasn't even through his music, so that shows you what a big nerd I am.
Wait, what was that event? What was that event in Seattle?
It was when I worked at a public library in Seattle. I was in Ballard, which is actually like the Norwegian capital of Seattle, and I got into Jonathan Lethem, who's a sci-fi author, and so I came across him through writings instead of his music.
Well, that's part of the thing that's about him is he's sort of moved all over the place.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of, it's a fascinating thing. But we're still trying to get him on hold here. So why don't you tell me, you just were at an alchemy conference, right?
I totally was. I was at the Alchemy Convention, which was in Long Beach, beautiful Long Beach, California.
And was that fun? Did you give a talk?
I did. It was really fun for me. I mean, for me it was like being a kid in a candy store because I got to meet all of these alchemists whose works I've been reading for the last 20 years or so. So it was very exciting for me to meet in the flesh a lot of the chemical alchemists I was really excited about, like Robert Bartlett and Dennis William Hawke and, people that do actually laboratory alchemy. And I got to serve on a panel with them, and I talked about science and alchemy. So it was really, really just like dork heaven for me.
That's one. Well, we're going to have to get some of these characters on so we can let you further indulge your dork heavenliness.
That'd be great.
But I think we got Paul on the line now. Paul, are you there?
Hey, hello.
Hey, man, how's it going?
All right. It's a very warm, balmy day here in New York.
Yeah, it's still toasty here down in Houston. I was telling folks about how we first met when I recognized the leg bebe on one of the stickers you had back in the day at the Village Voice, and just talking about what a trip it's been to track your career as you move through so many worlds and across the world. When I think about a global citizen, or certainly a global cultural citizen, I definitely think of you, and so it makes total sense that your recent work takes you to the far edge of the globe.
Yeah.
To Antarctica. So, I know you just came out with this book, so you've been talking about it a lot, but, I just, once again, I'd love to hear how you got down there and how you set it up, what drew you to the continent, and what you did there.
Sure. Antarctica is one of those places where back in the day it used to be here, there be monsters, right? But at this point we now rush in to fill in those spaces. There's sort of GPS, lockdown fever. And what ends up happening to me as an artist, as a writer, as a musician, a lot of my work is about the metropolis, going to the mega cities, Sao Paulo, Tokyo, Beijing, you name it. And one of the things that I've noticed over the course of the years is that DJ culture, like so many things right now, has become very standardized. So rhythm tempo shifts between, say, for example, dubsteps is maybe a certain tempo, hip-hop's at a certain tempo, techno, all of those things. I was like, let me hit the reset button on that and figure out some other ways to think about composition. And if you think about landscape and the American imagination, our music comes from these kinds of generative syntaxes. The city itself is a kind of, to me, like a language machine. And Antarctica was the most remote I could think about in terms of some of those issues. So that combined with thinking about kind of new forms of landscape composition, new forms of looking at graphic design, things like that, just sort of inevitably pushed me towards that place.
So what was it like though? How long were you there? And it's like one of those places you can't help but create a fantasy in your head when you imagine what it's like.
Yeah, Herzog was there when I was shooting. He was in McMurdo. I was over near the Weddell Icy Shelf, and then several areas throughout the continent. So I was there for about 4 weeks on the actual continent and a week plus in transition between the Drake Passage and other areas around the continent. So, yeah, man, it's definitely, the funny thing for me is the sociology of coldness, the idea of ice. So much of black culture in the 70s and 60s, the idea of cold, cold-blooded, cold, iceberg slim, birth of the cool. So much of our sociology is reflective of this idea of the Freudian notion of the cold person, this kind of. But Antarctica kind of almost embodies that, all puns intended, as a kind of a document If you look at the dust particles in the air and the things that get trapped in the ice, it actually is layer for layer. It's kind of like a record digging down into the ice cores.
Yeah, I mean, isn't that like one of the things about the ice there is it's almost like Earth. I mean, you can like dig down in a core and you can identify different qualities of the crystals and different material that's embedded in it. So it becomes like a geological record, even though it's frozen. It's largely frozen water.
Yeah, I mean, the fun part about that is, like, let's think of the record itself as a record. I mean, the planet is billions of years old, but, I mean, you're in Texas here. You know, we'd have to argue that point with Rick Perry, I'm sure, right? But, you know, that's billions of years of history that is, I think, incredibly intuitive about shaping evolution. And I think arts, sciences, we need to see much more of a convergence of how, you know, people can think of the creative act right now. So hip-hop, techno, all the kind of music that I've usually referenced, what I wanted to do was look at some of my heroes in classical music, people like Yannis Xenakis, people like Steve Reich, and then think about a kind of a hip-hop response to climate change and then just sort of hit the reset button. So the whole notion of, like, geology, archaeology, you know, what they call ice core sampling. It literally is the same term as what we call sampling in hip-hop. You know, these are issues where I think you can do a conceptual playfulness with the idea of the Earth. It's not just like, there's some people like James Lovelock that have what he calls Gaia theory, or, you know, the poet Gary Snyder with his sort of poetry looking at environmental issues. But a lot of people tend to think of the city as separate from nature. For some reason or another, it's a subconscious thing about the artificial versus the natural. So if you go back to the 20th century and the rise of naturalism, like the most twisted part of it was the way the Third Reich used nature and purity to create a counterpoint to what they call Entata Kunst, Entata Musik. So there was people like Caspar David Friedrich. There's a very famous painting of him staring out over this huge ocean of fog from a mountaintop. You know, so there's this kind of Nietzschean update, you know. But when you think about hip-hop, you just stare at major expanses of the grid of the city just sort of locked into urban infrastructure, you know, and that's the imagination. So
yeah. No, it's a trip. I mean, even just thinking about, like, what's the relationship with, you know, between hip-hop and nature, because it's, you know, like with you know, white hippie music or whatever, it's like so clear that like nature becomes the site of an imagined either utopian space or a space of resistance or a space of kind of holism or of balancing or whatever. And, you know, that too is even traced to some of those German sources. I mean, there's a very, very strong connection between some of the movements that the Nazis were appropriating, that were earlier kinds of, you know, return to nature, nudism, Wandervogel, these like Germanic romantic movements, which have some really positive stuff, but clearly could get very, very twisted. And that like flows into, you know, to a lot of the hippie lore and that kind of edge of stuff. But it's always fascinating when you think about that it's not that there's an absence of nature in hip hop. Obviously, it's still a motive force, a thing to refer to, but it's a real interesting space. I mean, like, so how do you feel like the stuff you were doing with Antarctica or other things you were doing were kind of playing with that zone?
Well, all right. My first multimedia major sort of project was Rebirth of a Nation, where I got the rights to D.W. Gifford's film Birth of a Nation and remixed it. And the motto for that project was Director as DJ. And one of the things that really intrigued me about, again, looking back when you're talking about nature and the idea of rural and folk culture, was in the origins of American pop culture. If you go to the minstrel show, it was usually whites appropriating what they viewed as rural and or backwards black culture and then putting on blackface. And Birth of a Nation sort of tied into this idea of appropriated identity and the way cinema, it's like the DNA of American cinema. So if you look at Apocalypse Now, for example, there's a very famous scene where they put loudspeakers out over a helicopter and start bombing a Vietnamese village, but they're playing Wagner, you know. And so it's this kind of Wagner was the composer par excellence of this idea of the state of nature and, you know, the kind of the Nietzschean or Dionysian or kind of all of there's a great essay that Nietzsche wrote called Nietzsche Against Wagner. That when you think about hip hop, Nietzsche is hip-hop. I mean, I've always chuckled over his very sharp use of terms, language, wordplay. So, all right, urban versus nature, nature versus artificial. Right now, I think we're looking at a movement of what they call the new urbanism, where people are trying to see, like there's the High Line in New York where they reclaimed an abandoned train, what they call the elevated, and made into a prairie. Or people are doing rooftop gardens, organic farms, literally in like old like places that would have been like junkyards or something. And that's that very, Brooklyn meets, the Upper West Side, East Side, you name it. So a lot of people are trying to reclaim natural spaces in the city. The problem is the imagination, and I think that same thing where I go back to Griffith is that the shaping of the American psyche around nature. I mean, you got to remember, Teddy Roosevelt was inspired by Emerson to start looking at making public parks and Waldens, Thoreau.
Same thing with John Muir. John Muir was totally deep into those transcendentalists.
Well, it all goes to really separation. I mean, I always go back to that Love and Rockets. You can't go against nature, because if you do, it's part of nature too. And with cities, I think people like to separate what's harsh from what they like. So when we think about what nature is, we like to think of like Bambi in the forest.
Right.
But they separate Antarctica too, because it's like too harsh, and we can't put it into our kind of realm. So we just separate it out from the rest of us and leave it in this like wasteland, when it's actually this gnarly ecological system that has all kinds of life there. And I think the same is true with like hip hop in cities. People like to separate that because it's harsh, or like ghettos are harsh, and so we don't like to include that in our realm of what we think is natural. But I think, lots of, like you were saying, how black culture goes back to ice with like Soul on Ice and all those kinds of things, that a lot of black people are trying to say, well, yeah, it is kind of harsh, but this is our life. Like, this is part of reality, the nature that is our life, so it has to be included. And I really like that you kind of bring that in with Antarctica, too.
Well, the funny thing is that, to me, a lot of the early DNA of hip-hop goes back to Iceberg Slim. He's this sort of rhyme sayer, the most famous picture of him is sitting on a huge pile of ice on his first record. And you had the Hustlers Convention, where everyone's nicknames is Ice, and Eldridge Cleaver, Soul on Ice. If you got the white guy, you got Vanilla Ice, you name it. But the pun here is I'm doing a wordplay with geography, with geology. It was it was a pleasure to go there, and actually it was the first time in my adult life, and I've traveled a lot, where there was absolutely no cell phone signal. There was satellite phones because we had to have an emergency phone. I carried a backpack with the studio equipment and hiked out into these huge glacier fields. And, it was just great sometimes to just sit and just watch these massive, just sort of sense of geology and peacefulness, But amusingly enough, the most twisted thing for me was the penguins. There's millions of them on the coasts, and they smell terrible. It's like they live in huge colonies, and they just take a crap right there, it's just, that's it. And it's just like, that's, living, literally in your own stuff. So the myth of the penguin, or these kind of funny, I always try and as much as possible incorporate a sense of humor into this kind of take on things. But amusingly enough, the sharpest sense you have when you're in Antarctica is a sense of smell, because the air is really, 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 really clean, and you realize how much you're desensitized with smog or pollution or whatever. I went to the North Pole this last year, the Arctic Circle, with the Cape Farewell project, and that's a project that's still in production. But amusingly enough, you have to be very cautious there, because polar bears can move up to 60 miles an hour when they run, and your lunch, you don't want to be caught. They can kill you with one blow and strip the meat from you in less than 5 to 10 minutes. I mean, it's pretty intense. But in Antarctica, there's no carnivores on the actual land, so it's you, the landscape, and the occasional penguin.
I'm curious, like, how much you took advantage of. I mean, you're always on the move. As like every time I talk to you, like, how's it going? Well, it's a little hectic, but it's exciting. And it's just, you're always, and you look at your website, you're always moving around, doing different projects, doing different events. And so then you're spending a couple of weeks in, this place where there's not a lot of external distraction, at least in the conventional urbanized sense of it. How much was that? How different was that for you? How much did it feel like actually just another place on your flow? I mean, did you think, oh yeah, now I can kind of tune into this slower pace or kind of piece that is I don't usually get to get into, or was it really just a part of the ongoing set of interests and things that drive you forward?
Well, this goes back to the idea of composer and landscape again. I mean, I really wanted to go there to make composition and think about deceleration, just getting out of, like you're saying, the hecticness of, there's a logic of the city, I tend to find that your sense of time gets very fractured. The geometry of the grid system, or even if you're in Europe like Venice or someplace like that, these kind of winding, quirky, curving streets. They change your sense of space and time in a lot of levels. Going to mountains, going to open plains, there's a lot of myths around that. American Indian cultures, even the Doors would sing, the American idea of on the road with Jack Kerouac, So for me, the landscape was okay, let me just be, literally, I mean, place in my adult life where it's you there and that's it. No cell phone, no computer. I mean, I brought my computer with me because I had to make material while I was there. But, yeah, peace. I mean, it's a very eerie sense of, just, you realize how stunningly beautiful the land is, and the deep sense of poetry that goes into these massive geologic formations that are sculpted by the wind, or the ice itself is just these stunning, I mean, really huge megastructures looming out of, just the collision of glacier fields and massive movements of ice. And there's nothing like it I've ever seen. I mean, the scale, the sense of vastness, it's very humbling for a human being to encounter that. I mean, it's just really, we've built these huge buildings, skyscrapers, massive, edifications, changed the course of rivers like the Mississippi, but the biggest engineering feat human beings have done was to change the atmosphere of the planet. I mean, that's what the whole global warming thing's about. And, yeah, I mean, these are heavy times, that's all I can say.
Yeah, that's for sure. So one of the things you were doing, you were recording the sounds of the ice and in a sense of the sounds of global warming. I mean, you were clearly, sampling, sonic records of not just the, nature in the raw, but nature changing. And what was that like? And particularly how do you deal with the specific as a way of looking at this phenomenon that's so much larger than any one map we can throw at it, of global warming?
Yeah, I mean, the complexity of global warming and the interdependency of all the variables that make up, why is global warming happening and climate change. You're looking at hyper-consumerism, people living way past their means, just even 1 liter of oil. I was reading this really fun description of Jan Arthas-Bertrand. He's a very renowned French photographer who did this book called Earth from Above. And, people were studying the statistics of oil. 1 liter of oil is the equivalent of 100 human hands working constantly for 24 hours, with just 1 liter, the amount of energy it releases. And I love the idea of saying that, horsepower, we're still measuring a car with horsepower. We're using quirky dynamics to try and measure things that it just doesn't make sense anymore. It's saying that, the paper that you're writing on, or the machines we're using, or the petroleum that we're burning, it has consequences, but somehow we always think of it as, this is just transient. Just burn it, use it, and it will just somehow magically reappear. That's the abundance, Yeah,
it's astounding. I mean, it took me, it's weird. I mean, I was reading I was getting into the climate change and then getting into peak oil. And it took me a long time of reading that material, which, I mean, we don't have to go into the debate about whether it's real or what exactly is going on, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, it's interesting, it's important stuff, but what I'm thinking about now is how long it took me to really realize how completely unusual and ridiculously powerful petroleum is. I just had this map in my head. It's oh yeah, we have horses, and then there's there's coal, which is kind of like petroleum, and then, then we figure out how to like refine this material. It's just, it's a little better. That was kind of like the ignorant set in my head. And it just took me a while of like banging my head against it to realize what a completely bizarre and therefore incredibly powerful and transformative force petroleum has been, just in terms of like manifesting, the human imagination, or manifesting objects, manifesting shapes in plastic, and that that there's nothing like it. There's nothing like it. It's going to come down the pike unless some, magic technological, revolution occurs. But it was just striking to me, just, supporting what you're saying, how long psychologically it took for me to recognize how unusual our situation is.
Yeah, and what's funny to me is when I was a kid, one of the first books that ever dealt with Antarctica that I read was H.P. Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. And there's a kind of, these characters awaken and they find themselves in this incredible frozen city that is just at the edge of the map, and they realize they're flying through these huge fields of a different kind of urbanism. And, H.P. Lovecraft always has some weird racial politics and all sorts of quirky stuff with I'm not sure I'm pronouncing it right, Cthulhu, something.
Yeah, Cthulhu.
Yeah, Cthulhu mythos. But these are like people, creatures that are older than that.
Well, it's interesting, too, because you can get into the symbolism of Antarctica, right? It's the southernmost part of the planet. So if you get into, like, yin and yang and cold and dark, even in, like, Chinese philosophy, Antarctica is that literal female repository of the planet Earth, where everything is the most kind of pungent and full of the possibility of every kind of life. So I think when Lovecraft was saying there was the possibility for those like ancient kind of primordial gods, Antarctica is symbolically the representative of the primordial creative nature of kind of Earth and everything.
Right. But another like kind of funny take on that is from Kim Stanley Robinson, who's a science fiction writer, or there's been other, Jules Verne's written some stuff about the region, but I always was intrigued by how Lovecraft had to have all this kind of sort of racial conflict and species conflict at the core of a lot of his oeuvre. And, with the way he would map, class and race into the creatures, and the idea of miscegenation and mixed, forms of people and stuff like that. So when I was reading that as a kid, it really blew my mind. And I think it, as a seed, definitely left some quirky, like, morphic resonances about how we think about conflict and species and so on. So the funny thing is, there's by our standards of the teeming life of the tropics and so on, where we're used to so many different permutations of evolution, we're not engineered for this place. If you fall in the water, you die in about 2 minutes. And when I see, a Weddell ice seal just lounging, and I'm freezing, and the seals looking at me like, "What are you doing here?" It's just they're not engineered for fear, because they haven't had predators like human beings to come around and just kill them. So they look at you as an alien species, like you're coming there, and there's not a fight or flight evolution in most of the creatures there. They just look at you. Stuff like that, where you're just walking around and like they're not running from you. They're like, "What are you doing here?" It was refreshing, actually.
I bet. It's actually a really rare opportunity to be. There's so many places that humans go, even if we're going to go out into the quote-unquote wilderness, it sort of feels like our wilderness. Like, we have a place here, too, and there's just no way you're going to pull that off with Antarctica. It's like, look, man, we have just not been here. We might have reasons to be here because we're on the globe, but, like, this is not our place. It's like probably the most like being on another planet, at least if you leave outside the deep, the deep sea, which is of course even weirder. But we should probably take a break right now. You're listening to Expanding Mind. We're talking to Paul Miller about Antarctica and other global zones, and we'll be right back after these messages.
Welcome back to Expanding Mind on the Progressive Radio Network. I'm Maja Daou. We're here with Erik Davis, and we're talking about ice with Paul Miller, also known as DJ Spooky. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about discovery and kind of the implications that Antarctica holds there. I know we talked a little bit about how we have the ice record and the core samples, and even just how there is always in the ice, it holds this, like, you know, that's where mammoths can be discovered and like Neanderthals and all these crazy things that we discover in the ice. But even as a continent, that it holds these kind of mysterious answers, and really the only people there are kind of scientists that are trying to like extract these mysteries from frozen in this ice. Did you kind of get that feeling of discovery of mystery when you were there?
Yeah, I mean, one of the first things that when you cross through the oh my God, I can't believe I'm blanking on the Straits of Magellan. And just what ends up happening is, like, you see these massive waves slamming into your ship. You know, it's just like incredible. And then by the time you get there, you've already been upheaving and you know, just literally, all puns intended, like just serious waves hit like 26 feet high, hitting the side of a ship. That was one thing. And then when you get there, your sense of scale gets really scrambled because of the distance. And also on top of that, like these huge open spaces. Often the sun doesn't set when it's summer, and the sun doesn't come up when it's winter. So you're in this kind of twilight limbo. Mm-hmm. When I was there, it was Antarctic summer, which was still cold enough to kill you in 2 minutes if you fell in the water. And what ends up happening is, like, say, for example, there's these parables of, like, paranoia and, almost, again, like, there's so much science fiction about Antarctica that's, like, horror, like The Thing.
Totally. Good.
You know, your body losing its self to some sort of, you know, cellular invasion or something. But amusingly enough, those are cautionary tales, whereas I tend to find it's the opposite, where you just really get the sense of expansion and openness. And there's a kind of lyricism, but you have to be incredibly careful. I mean, you're just not geared for the weather and or for the terrain. And if you fall in the ice and you break your legs, one guy in our team had a heart attack because he kind of fudged on his health form. You had to fill out forms and say that you were in good health. And it took a day for a plane to fly in from, if I remember correctly, some Argentinian military base. And then there was another time where a ship got hit and sank. Wow. It was in the news and stuff like that because they had a navigational error and smashed into an iceberg. You know, that's heavy stuff to happen, and you just. So I was there for, like I said, 6 weeks, 1 week each direction over the Straits of Magellan because the weather and the waves. And, you know, you just realize it's the most utopian place on Earth. And amusingly enough, it's where most of the major countries have signed what they call the Treaty of Antarctica from 1959. So it's the only place on Earth with no government. And it's the only place that literally all the other major governments have signed off to say that there will be no development, no military bases. It's strictly for science. So at any given time, there's only about 2,000 people in the entire continent. And they're sharing information. People are much more engaged with, like, climate change issues, very aware, a lot of idealistic scientists, quirky people because they're stuck in these weird bases for months at a time, you know, but definitely geek chic, I guess that's all I can call it.
Well, and so tell me about, like, how you play with that idea of this sort of liminal utopia, geek chic, you know, exterior space of Antarctica with the whole, like, you know, a lot of the most striking images in your book, along with the archival images, to me, were these great posters for, you know, Manifesto for a People's Republic of Antarctica, and you really are kind of playing with this whole sort of idea of the nation and what is the nation from the perspective of a place like Antarctica. Yeah,
well, all right. If you go back to, like, again, I think the 20th century was one of the bloodiest and most vicious centuries in terms of just mass slaughter, like crazy, you know, Chairman Mao killed 60 million plus people, Stalin 20 million plus, God knows how many, Hitler. You know, so there's all of these movements, amusingly enough, they had art, Chinese revolutionary posters, of course Russian stuff with Malevich, Sergei Eisenstein, people like, Hitler with the Antarctica Kunst, and or people like Leni Riefenstahl. So what would happen if there was all of a sudden an art movement without this kind of sense of nation state and or revolution and or just saying it's about being, and I chuckled over that when I was making these posters because I wanted to go for kind of, just a pun about, there's a science fiction book called The People's Republic of Antarctica. And if you look at Kim Stanley Robinson or if you look at a couple other sort of pretty major novels, Mountains of Madness and so on, people are fascinated with this idea of the epic journey of the travel. So there's the Scott expeditions. There's even Roald Amundsen is this Norwegian who discovered the South Pole. And in fact, this year marks the 100th anniversary of the discovery of the South Pole, because he discovered it in 1911 and it's now 2011. So, there was a lot of stuff that I was thinking about when I was involved in setting this up. And above all, the pun is that graphic design and climate change are about, I think, making compelling frames of reference for people to engage. So the problem right now, I was horrified, shocked, and of course really saddened by the last Republican debate where they're saying, Rick Perry, again, you guys are in Texas, sorry, I like Austin, but they were just like, he just said, the science isn't settled. And he then said, well, like Galileo, we need to understand the climate change. He kind of drew a parallel between Galileo and our current debate about climate change.
Well, that's uber sad then, because Galileo got burned alive by the church, so
yeah, exactly.
That's where all that goes.
Yeah, and I was just like, what planet is this guy on? But the other Republican candidates were essentially not in a negative against them. Most of them agreed that the science, they were just like, and you realize, it's not about science for these people, it's about emotional logic. And the idea that denying anything, it flies in the face of any kind of facts. So what ends up happening is you have what psychologists would call, suspended belief, or just when people imagine just looking at the sky and instead of saying it's blue, you say it's, purple, and then everyone you try and pound everyone else around you to say that the sky is purple.
It's a really weird thing. I mean, my dad's a oceanographer and has worked with climate people and been on committees and all this stuff. And so I've been hearing about the science of this stuff for a while. And I've even pressed him on the ambivalent or the ambiguity in the data and what can we really say and the complexities because it's such a complex, in a technical sense. Problem, but it's like most rational people, it's pretty clear that what's going on, exactly what percentage it has to do with human input is in some fundamental sense unknowable, but the conclusions are pretty obvious. And yet I've met people, I met some folks who are really smart people. I could tell they were kind of conservative libertarian types, but we were hanging out and chatting, and as the conversation went along, I was like going, man, they just live in a different world than I do. It's not even, and I'm open. I'm trying to talk. I don't care if you have certain kinds of principles. I'm really to sit down and have a conversation with you and try to figure out what's going on. And then I was like, oh, wait. I bet their climate, I bet they don't even think there's any kind of change happening here or that there's anything anomalous about it. And yes, indeed, that was the case.
Yeah.
And it was like their whole world, like where they got their information, what they meant about it. It was really like, oh, we are not exactly sharing the same planet. I probably have more in common with some, farmer working in the most, primitive parts of India than you right now, because I'm just in a different world. And it's like that affect, that world of affect, that's what you talked about. It's like, it's not just cognitive. It's not just about the media sources. It's about an affect world, a world of framing, of how you frame experience. And that's where design and messaging and stuff really play a significant role.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, art can speak to things that sometimes people won't be able to really envision, even if they accept the science, even if they agree with things. Somehow art can touch other parts of the mind. You're dealing with different modalities. Same thing with music, I think the civil rights would have been a radically different movement if it had not a good soundtrack, or for that matter, if you look at the song Amandla, which was the sort of rallying cry in South Africa, you know, they have a good soundtrack. So song and revolution, or songs and change, I mean, I'm down with that, and I was just trying to figure out with the compositions right now. I have to admit, normal hip-hop and normal electronic music and so on, we're drowning in it. I mean, there's so much. And most people these days who have reasonable computer skills can make beats and so on. So how do we get to the next step where it's about ideas and music, ideas and art? Art is always about ideas, but somehow science and the idea of just sort of testing hypotheses and, you know, kind of the dialectics of process. If you can think of a musician or art scene, you know, there's people like Brian Eno and David Byrne who've definitely done a lot of contemporary art stuff with music. But I'm a big fan of people like Stockhausen, Xenakis, and Steve Reich for radically different reasons for each composer, but looking at the use of concepts in their material.
I was curious, too, speaking about soundtracks and how you came up with the music, if you were influenced at all by, like, Paul Bowles and some of his ideas and how he kind of soundtracked the landscape in some of his work.
Oh, yeah, I love his stuff. I haven't checked him out in a while, but I know in terms of his stuff with the desert and the relationship of North Africa and desert landscapes, you know, there's definitely a connection between how you could think about a writer engaging the desert, and you got to remember Antarctica is the world's largest desert. Even though there's land, you know, there's water, but it's frozen in specific form. And one of the things that was another big inspiration for the group of compositions I've generated, a lot of which are available on my website, which is just djspooky.com/Antarctica, no spaces, is I was looking at the geometry of ice, and one of the guys I worked with for this is named Brian Greene. He wrote this book, The Elegant Universe. So I asked Brian to write about the physics of ice. Ice is a really interesting form between liquid and solid. So Brian was really excited to write about ice because it's also got a lot of really intriguing qualities that he gets into with his whole idea of subatomic particles and the way that they form strange attractors and muons, nuons, gluons, all sorts of quirky terms. So ice, for physicists, is a really intriguing substance. You can actually use it in particle accelerators to see certain particles. So Brian just went off and wrote this wild essay, which I was really happy with. And I also got the guy who's the director for Dartmouth's Cold Regions Research Labs, Ross A. Virginia. He's a sort of legendary figure because Dartmouth has one of the best cold regions sort of Arctic studies programs in the country, Arctic and Antarctic. So I wanted to make sure that there's a good balance between graphic design and information, which is always, you know, music is music. People are like, hey, man, why don't you just play a song, man? You know, and I kind of always want to add more information. And, you know, that makes me, amusingly enough, a controversial figure, even though I don't view myself, I'm pretty chilled out. But I definitely pissed off I got into a flame more recently with some Republicans who were following my Twitter feed. And, you know, they were just like total Neanderthal. But it's incredible that people will get mad about music, art, and kind of a search for a different process to think about information right now. I mean, Jesus, these are heavy times. This morning I turned on the TV and you're looking at this week is the United Nations and Palestine's declaring statehood and so on. And you're just like, the nation state, as we've inherited from the 20th century, people still have these kinds of, I don't know, like the idea of the nation state for me is very specific to like a different era. You know, these are much more fluid.
Well, I think like you said, I mean, Republicans can get so incensed, and it's no surprise to me that they would follow it on your Twitter feed and then try and get upset, is because, like you said, the soundtrack to these political movements is very important, right? And that is what captures people's hearts and people's souls. So when people are part of a political movement, they want to keep nation states, they want to keep that, and someone comes up with these ideas of breaking those down, of having civil rights movements. I mean, what happens to those artists, right? They get flack, they get trouble, they get put in jail. So, I mean, it's no joke, right? When you're trying to make a soundtrack of breaking down borders, I mean, yeah, these guys are going to get upset.
Well, what's really interesting too with this whole issue about climate change is that most of the politics that we would think of in terms of having music associated with the politics, the civil rights movement's example, Palestinian music, whatever, it's like they're identity movements. They're on some level. They have to do with the clash of different kinds of ethnicities or historically constructed subjects of nation states, blah blah blah, and so those things are all associated with certain kinds of music, with certain genres, certain attitudes in music. But like, what is a soundtrack, or what is a rallying kind of music for climate change? I mean, in a way, that was one of the questions you were asking. One thing we haven't really talked about is like, what were some of the compositional decisions that you ended up making, or how did the piece that emerged from your recordings in Antarctica deal with some of these questions that you were having about this larger issue of music and climate change?
Yeah, let's put it this way. When you think about music and nature, right, I mean, probably the first major environmental music piece is Handel's Water Music from like 1717. It was commissioned by King George I. They put different orchestras on these barges and had them move up and down the River Thames. And King George liked it a lot and just said, look, tell the musicians to just keep playing. And so you'd hear this weird Doppler effect, and the barges would be carrying small orchestras following the currents of the river, which I kind of dig. There's like, Mahler's Song of the Earth. There's Wagner's whole, kind of nature cycle stuff. There's Scriabin. I mean, there's lots of traditions in the Western classical context. It's not a problem. I mean, even John Cage he has this one piece called In a Landscape from 1948. So, if you look at the black scene, I mean, I'm really fascinated with stuff like Take the A Train, or A Tone Poem for Harlem by Duke Ellington. There's lots to be said for conceptual music. I mean, it's just, the problem is probably, at the end of the day, it's the construction of the mass production of culture. It's just like how people are conditioned to think about patterns and formula. So composition-wise, what I wanted to do was think about hip-hop, classical, electronic, all sorts of styles, and say, what would happen if you just ended up in this remote place and your batteries were failing and you had to sit and write in some, and actually use paper and or, digital notepad and see what happened. So the compositions I wrote came out of, I would say, there's the U.S. is a kind of a collision between polyphony, which is meaning many rhythms, and polytonality, which is this European idea of point, counterpoint, all sorts of stuff going into it. So when you think about the 18th and 19th century, and the collision between African and European forms, I mean, it's pretty easy to fast forward and see hip-hop. That's not a problem. Techno is a little more abstract at one level, but it's also more reductionist. And, other kinds of electronic music, if you look at Kraftwerk, especially like their stuff about the Autobahn and the movement, and that's another kind of landscape, like open source, open areas where the car is supposed to be free to move, and they went to do a soundtrack around that. Those are some of the most influential songs of the last half of the 20th century. I'm a huge fan of stuff like Yellow Magic Orchestra. They have this one song called Riot in Lagos. John Cage is a big influence. So the piece is still in development. I'm probably playing...
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt you. This is kind of an amusing environmental effect, but right now the emergency alarm is going off in the building that I'm on, so it's kind of a cool, pretty DJ spooky sound. I mean, that's a pretty kind of, cool scene. So I'm probably just going to have to log off here, but you guys keep talking. You got about 4 more minutes. So I'll leave you in Maj's hands. I'm totally looking forward to hearing how this piece evolves, and thanks for being on the show, Paul.
All right, Gary. Hey, it was a pleasure as always to catch up and get out of that building safe, I guess.
Okay, I'll see you guys.
All right.
Yeah, split the seed. But since we just have a couple minutes left, can you tell folks how they can get a hold of your Antarctica material and how can they order it off your website?
Yeah, there's 2 issues. One, it's a book called The Book of Ice, and the book just came out with Mark Batty Publishers / Thames and Hudson. And the whole idea is that I wanted to do a book about graphic design and sound. So all the compositions in the book are playable. There's QR code imprints. But the easiest way to just get information about it is just djspooky.com/Antarctica. And the book's on Amazon. It's also an e-book that you can get from Apple. And it's kind of like the equivalent of of an app when you get the ebook version that has all these kind of hyperlinks to environmental issues and stuff like that. So it's a really beautiful book. I was really happy with the graphic design and the way that came out. So yeah, it's available in most normal bookstores. When I'm in when I'm in Austin, I'm going to have a big book launch at Domi, which is a great bookstore. And I'll be in Austin next week signing my books, and I have a big project with the Austin City Ballet.
That's awesome. And are you going to play any of it live anywhere at all? Any plans to do live DJ sets for us?
Yeah, that's going to be probably intermittent. Next year I'm going to do a full-length album around it. Right now the book just came out, so I'm doing about 28 cities right now of support for the book, and then part 2 will be more of these kind of Antarctic events and happenings. This year is definitely a pretty packed schedule.
And it's all surrounding ice for you, huh?
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, these are very strange times, and if you think about half the state of Texas is on fire, huge glacier fields are breaking off, Fukushima, the whole radiation thing. These are times where people really need to update their sense of literacy about the climate.
Well, I think it's so appropriate, too. I mean, a lot of people think of the Earth and our situation as this, stable, like you said, we have these endless resources. We never have to worry about it. But to me, Antarctica itself is this continent that's iced, which is this kind of transitory material. It's always shifting and changing and melting and cruising around. So I think that, in general, can show people, everything is in flux. Everything is constantly changing, and the changes that we affect on it, too. I think Antarctica is a perfect symbol for trying to get into people's minds the changes that we're undergoing,
Yeah, I hope it's a metaphor, it's an art project, it's a group of compositions, and at the end of the day, it's looking at a book as a kind of, I'm really into graphic design and old school graphic novels, and I'm a big fan of stuff like Philip Glass's Canascazzi. So there's lots to be said for how composers, artists, writers can catalyze things, and I think maybe up a little bit. That little beeping sounds, my battery on my phone is about to die, too.
Oh, okay, that's good. Well, we're out of time. Thanks so much, Paul, for everything, and folks, you can go check out his website.